Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some scientific news sticks with you and feels totally believable, while other stuff makes you scratch your head and wonder what the deal is? Today we're diving into a fascinating study that explores why we trust science, especially when things get a little messy. This research asks a really big question: does how trustworthy science seems to us all about how good the research is? Or does it have more to do with what we already want to believe? They looked at something called Myside bias, which is basically our tendency to favor information that already fits with our own opinions. And they also checked out the growing trend of open science practices, like sharing data and pre-registering studies. The big surprise? It seems our own beliefs might be stronger influencers than how transparent scientists are. We all know science is important, right? It drives innovation, helps create better policies, and basically moves society forward. Most people agree with this overall idea, but when you dig a little deeper, a lot of folks admit they don't always trust scientists. This can be a problem, especially when we need to make big decisions about things like health or technology. Think about things like vaccine hesitancy, or how some people react to new discoveries. This trust isn't just about whether science is good, but also about how we personally process that information and what the science is actually about. One of the biggest individual factors is something called Myside bias. This is more than just looking for information that confirms what you already think. It's about actively favoring evidence that matches your own views and more easily dismissing anything that goes against them. Imagine you have a strong opinion about something, say, a certain kind of treatment. If you hear good news about it, you might readily accept it. But if you hear something critical, you might be quicker to find flaws or reasons to doubt it, even if that critical information is sound. This bias can be really powerful, especially when people have strong beliefs or values tied to a certain topic. For instance, political leanings can shape how we see scientific findings, particularly on controversial subjects. Beyond Myside bias, there is also general trust in science. Some people just have a more positive or negative outlook on science and scientists overall. This is like a stable attitude that can influence how they view individual research findings. And then there is how folks understand the scientific process itself. We assume science is super transparent and rigorous. But sometimes people might not fully grasp all the steps involved, like how data is collected, analyzed, and reviewed. On the other hand, what scientists are studying also matters. Not all scientific topics are equally controversial. Sometimes the evidence is mixed, and a specific study might lean one way, but the bigger picture is still debated. Think about things like gender-sensitive language or complementary and alternative medicine. These topics often get tangled up in broader social and political discussions. This is where open science practices come in. Things like sharing your data, making your research materials available, or pre-registering your study plan before you even start are meant to signal honesty and rigor. The idea is that if researchers are open about their work, they have nothing to hide, and this should build trust. But the research suggests that while people say they trust scientists more when they see these practices, it is not always clear if it actually changes their minds, especially when the science touches on something they feel strongly about. So, this study wanted to figure out how all these pieces fit together. They had people read plain language summaries of scientific studies. Some of these studies were about topics people might have strong opinions on, like gender-sensitive language or alternative medicine. They wanted to see if these summaries were more or less trustworthy depending on whether the findings confirmed or contradicted what the participants already believed, and if mentioning open science practices made a difference. They wanted to test two main ideas. First, that reporting open science practices would always boost trust, and second, that open science would only boost trust when the scientific findings already aligned with what people believed. To do this, the researchers recruited over 1,000 participants from Austria. They showed these participants different summaries of scientific studies. Some summaries were about gender-sensitive language, and others were about complementary and alternative medicine. For each topic, they presented a neutral finding. A finding that confirmed the participants' likely existing views, and the finding that contradicted them. Importantly, for some of these summaries, they added a sentence mentioning that the research used open science practices like data sharing or pre-registration, while others didn't mention it. After reading the summaries, participants rated how trustworthy they thought each study was. They also measured people's general trust in science and their attitudes towards gender-sensitive language and alternative medicine, which they used as a way to gauge their Myside bias. They ended up with a good number of participants, over 1,000, and their backgrounds were pretty representative of the Austrian population, which is great for making sure the results aren't just specific to one type of person. Looking at the numbers, you can see a lot of interesting connections. For example, general trust in science, meaning how much people generally trust scientists, had a pretty strong link with how much they trusted the specific study summaries. Now, let's get to the really juicy findings. They ran some detailed analyses, and here is the core story. When they looked at the topic of gender-sensitive language, what they found was that whether or not open science practices were mentioned didn't actually change how much people trusted the summaries. This held true whether they looked at it alone or in combination with other factors. So, their first big hypotheses, which suggested open science would boost trust, weren't supported. This led them to simplify things and focus on the other factors. They found that people's attitudes towards gender-sensitive language, their Myside bias, did matter. The stronger someone's existing beliefs about gender-sensitive language, the more they trusted summaries that confirmed those beliefs. But this effect was pretty moderate. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. When they added in that general trust and science factor, it completely dwarfed the other effects. People who generally trusted science a lot tended to trust all the study summaries more, regardless of whether they confirmed or contradicted their personal views. This strongly supported their hypothesis that general trust is a huge predictor. They did the same analysis for the topic of complementary and alternative medicine, or CAM. And again, mentioning open science practices didn't seem to influence trust levels. It just didn't move the needle. Similar to the GSL topic, they found that Myside bias played a role, but this time the effect was much stronger. If people already had strong positive feelings about CAM, they trusted the summaries that supported CAM much more than those that didn't. It suggests that for a topic like CAM, people's existing beliefs have a pretty big impact on how they evaluate the science. And just like with gender-sensitive language, general trust in science was the biggest player. People who generally trusted science were more likely to trust these summaries, no matter what the finding was. Interestingly, the study also looked at people's ideas about how science works. They discovered that people tend to believe open science practices are used much more often than they actually are. And when people do think about these practices, they see them as trust increasing. However, because people think these practices are the norm, explicitly mentioning them might not add much extra trust. So, what is the big takeaway from all this? Essentially, when people read simple summaries of scientific studies, especially on topics that are a bit controversial or touch on personal beliefs, their own pre-existing views there Myside bias seem to be more important than whether the study followed open science practices. The researchers found that mentioning data sharing or pre-registration didn't really boost trust on its own. Instead, if a scientific finding matched what people already believed, they were more likely to trust it. This was especially true for topics like complementary and alternative medicine, where people might have strong personal feelings or experiences. But even more powerful than Myside bias was people's general attitude towards science. If you generally trust scientists and the scientific process, you are more likely to trust individual findings, even if they might be a bit controversial or challenge your personal views. If you don't have a lot of general trust, then your Myside bias really kicks in, and you are more likely to just believe what you want to believe. Now, it is important to note some limitations. The studies focus on topics that are already a bit contentious and tied to social issues. So this might not apply as much to science fields like physics or astronomy, where values might not be as directly involved. Also, the way they mentioned open science was pretty subtle, just a single sentence at the end. Future studies might explore more detailed explanations of what open science actually means. And the way they measured people's ideas about science was also a bit limited. They mostly focused on open science, and future work could explore other aspects of the scientific process. Plus, people might not have spent a lot of time thinking about these things before, so their answers might be more spontaneous judgments. So, in short, while open science practices are crucial for the quality and integrity of research itself, simply mentioning them in a brief summary doesn't seem to be enough to convince people to trust the science if it goes against what they already believe. Our own beliefs and our general feelings about science are much bigger drivers of that trust, especially when the science gets a little complicated. This research really highlights how important it is to think critically about our own biases when we consume scientific information. It's not just about what scientists say, but also about our own filters. For science communication, this means that simply stating facts might not be enough. We need to consider how to engage people on a deeper level, acknowledging that trust is a complex mix of our skepticism, our predispositions, and our overall view of the scientific enterprise. It also suggests that promoting general trust in science is a fundamental step towards a more informed public. It makes you wonder if we need to do more to build that foundational trust in science itself, rather than just relying on specific practices that might not resonate with everyone. When it comes to Myside bias and topics like gender-sensitive language, it shows how our personal values can really shape how we see evidence. If something aligns with our core beliefs, we're more likely to accept it. And with Gehm, the link between personal preference and trust is even stronger, suggesting that when our health and well-being are on the line, our existing beliefs can be very powerful. Ultimately, this study offers a valuable glimpse into the complex landscape of public trust in science. It reminds us that while transparency is vital behind the scenes for researchers from a public perception standpoint, it is our internal compass, our existing beliefs, and our general trust in science that often guides what we're willing to accept. If you found this breakdown as interesting as I did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology and science. Let me know in the comments what you think about Myside bias and its impact on how you view scientific news. See you next time.